Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 8th, 1973, a man by the name of Ben Fernandez appeared before the Senate Watergate Committee. Fernandez was an early, vocal, and influential advocate for Latino involvement in Republican politics. He co-founded the Republican National Hispanic Assembly. He served as a fundraiser for Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. That is what brought him before the Watergate hearings, where he testified but was ultimately exonerated of any wrongdoing. But we want to talk about Ben Fernandez less for his testimony during Watergate and more as a way to talk about the group of voters that he devoted his life to organizing, Republican Latinos. In the wake of the 2020 election, I'm sure you've noticed there is lots of talk about conservative Latinos, how they may have helped secure Donald Trump's victory, though different groups in different ways, and we will get into that question of how different Latino groups often get clumped together in modern politics. But this feels like a good moment to talk about the history of the GOP and the Latino vote. And here to do that, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And also with us is Geraldo Cadava, professor of history at Northwestern University, who specializes in just this. He's written a book about it, The History of the Hispanic Republican. Geraldo, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell us, let's start with the guy at the center of all this. What do we need to know about Ben Fernandez?
He is such a fascinating character. He's probably the single most fascinating character that I came across while doing the research and writing. And he was born in as the legend goes, he was born in a railroad boxcar in Kansas City in 1925. And so his nickname was always Benjamin Boxcar Ben Fernandez. And then his family moved to the Midwest, where they worked in agricultural fields and finally settled in East Chicago, Indiana. That's where he went to high school. He enrolled at Purdue for a minute, but then he went to the University of the Redlands in California, and he kind of became a Californian from that point on, except for a brief period when he went to business school at NYU and worked at General Electric. But he returned to California to kind of become an economist and a consultant, and that's where he got really involved in Republican Party politics.
And how did he then find himself into Republican Party politics? How did he form his ideology, and then how did he start to do activism?
Yeah, well, his ideology, it really was about, the kind of classic immigrant narrative, up by the bootstraps, kid whose parents were Mexican immigrants, and he went to college, worked at General Electric, went to business school, became an economist. So he kind of realized his American dream. And that's his story about his political formation. He kind of became formally involved in Republican Party politics when Richard Nixon brought him into the administration as the director of the National Economic Development Agency, which was all about helping Latinos form banks, thrift banks, savings and loans banks. And that's how he became involved in politics. But then his star kind of rose within the Republican Party throughout the late 1960s and 1970s.
I'm curious whether he had any sort of personal relationship with Nixon. I could see an affinity there because Nixon himself comes from pretty humble origins and also sort of realizes the American dream as a member of Congress and then as vice president and then as president. But did they have a personal relationship, or was this a more transactional political relationship?
That's a great question. I actually never came across any kind of personal correspondence between Ben Fernandez and Richard Nixon. I think Fernandez was much more connected with other Hispanics who were closer to Nixon and who worked directly in the administration, like Henry Ramirez, who was the chairman of the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-speaking People. That was Ben Fernandez's world. And, I think a lot of Mexican Americans from Southern California, that's what you just said, these kind of humble origins in the kind of agricultural communities southeast of Los Angeles. That's how they identify with Nixon. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what Fernandez shares with him as well.
Is it true that the 72 Nixon campaign was the first one to create a formal outreach committee for Latinos?
A presidential campaign itself, one that was organized by the campaign rather than kind of local grassroots organizations in California and Texas. Yes, I think that's the case. I mean, Nixon really used his Hispanic surrogates, many of whom he had appointed during his first administration, to kind of go out on the campaign trail and aggressively recruit Latino supporters. And it was definitely the first kind of presidential campaign to launch such a thing as a Hispanic finance committee that kind of traveled around the country raising money from Latinos for the presidential campaign. And, it was a pretty successful effort as far as things go. So he was the first president to kind of increase Latino support for a Republican candidate from single digit support to about a third, which has become the baseline for many Republican candidates since.
So help me understand this, because I think that the story that we tell about Nixon and race and the electorate is about the Southern strategy, right? It's about going after white voters, often alienating Black voters. But the idea of the Hispanic vote is not, I think, something that many historians have incorporated into that story of sort of like who was the Nixon electorate. So could you just talk us through how all of those pieces fit together?
Yeah, it's a great question. And because they are interlocking pieces in many ways. And in some ways, Nixon choosing to pursue white voters and choosing to pursue Hispanics might not be mutually exclusive, since at least many Latinos consider themselves to be white. That's not universally true. I mean, I loved coming across little snippets from Nixon administration members who called themselves like Chicano Mestizo warriors, which is Chicano Mestizo Cold Warriors, which is not how you would usually hear a Hispanic Republican describing their ethnic identity. But I think that also speaks to just the kind of general spirit of the civil rights era, and the Chicano movement. But I'm always fascinated by how, the Nixon administration in particular, in many ways, like embraces the language of the civil rights movement, and it's about inclusion and empowerment and all those things. But to directly answer your question, I mean, the Nixon administration and people close to him were very explicit about the need to reach out to Hispanic voters, because they clearly recognized that African Americans were leaving the party in great numbers very quickly, and they knew that they had to replace that lost support with other groups of voters, and Hispanic voters became prime targets. And just for the purposes of this conversation, let me say, I'm just going to keep saying Hispanic, because my book is called The Hispanic Republican, because that's the term that most Hispanic conservatives preferred for themselves. So I know it has kind of a different valence today than it did then, but just I'm gonna keep saying it.
Well, I'm glad you said that, but I think it also gets at some of the stuff that we're even seeing today, which is the interchangeable use of Hispanic and Latino, and then certainly just the reference to one big voting block as opposed to acknowledging the kind of different strands within that. And one thing that's really fascinating, looking back at this 72 campaign, there were distinct campaigns that were targeting Mexican Americans, but also Puerto Ricans and also Cuban Americans. So I wonder if you could just talk about those roots and those different kinds of strategies that existed even back when this was first arising as a block to target.
Yeah, totally. So, at Northwestern, I've taught Latino history probably 5 or 6 times by this point. And, the course is in many ways organized around this question of who or what is a Latino anyway. And that's certainly the explicit topic of the first week, but I think we return to it over and over. And it's just a kind of ongoing debate and conversation. I don't think it's a resolvable issue, but I think the ongoing conversation about it is part of the point. And I do think that the late 1960s and early 1970s, in part through the efforts of the Nixon administration, this is a kind of moment when Latinos, Hispanics are trying to articulate what are the things that bring them together, what are the things that make them unique. And that's a process that's not without tension. So Nixon, in some ways refurbishes Lyndon Johnson's Interagency Committee on Mexican American Affairs. That was the name of the organization during the Johnson years, perhaps because Mexican Americans were always the largest population, perhaps because he was from Texas. That was the group he was most familiar with. So one of the first things Nixon does is rename that group the Cabinet Committee on Opportunities for Spanish-Speaking People. And even that shift signals a shift in thinking about identity and how there should be some effort at this moment to try to group the different national groups together under the same umbrella. And that is a process that came with some tension. So this cabinet committee, for example, it had 9 members, and its 9 members were supposed to be apportioned according to, the percentage of the population that different national groups represented. So there were supposed to be like 3 Mexican Americans, 3 Puerto Ricans, a couple of Cubans. And so this was an explicit attempt. And there was always kind of rivalry about who the chairman of that group should be. Should it be a Mexican American? Some people argue that the whole committee should be Mexican Americans because they were the most important group at the time. And it's a movement that was really started by Mexican Americans and only centrally involved Cubans after the 1980s. I think that's another kind of interesting topic. But, I think from that point forward, there have always been tensions, not just, within the Hispanic Republican movement about the differences between connections between different national groups and who has power within these organizations over the years, but also just in Latino America generally. I mean, we're continually debating our own ethnic self-conceptions.
I also think it's worth highlighting the relationship between Nixon and Cuban Americans in particular. I mean, one of his closest friends was Bebe Rebozo, and he was constantly his conventions were in Miami. He had a place in Miami. He was very knitted into that community. And then, of course, the Watergate burglars are taken from the Cuban American community.
Totally. Yeah, Nixon has a strong personal connection to the Cuban community and Cuban exiles throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s really were engaged with U.S.-Cuban relations, and they were still kind of holding out for this moment when groups of Cuban exiles would overthrow Castro and return triumphantly to Cuba to reclaim Cuba for Cuban patriots, right? And so this is, of course, related to the story of the Bay of Pigs, and Cuban exiles in South Florida were forming governments in exile that were going to go back. So the point is, because many Cubans in South Florida were still focused on Cuba, they didn't make a real investment in American politics, American electoral politics, until the 1970s and beyond. I mean, it's the mid-1970s, late 1970s, when there are large naturalization drives that make Cuban Americans citizens. So I think that that's important. I mean, all of these things are kind of emerging during the 1960s because Nixon has personal relationships with the kind of mafia underworld that had traveled to Havana. He is close friends with Bebe Rebozo. He allegedly, came into some land in Florida and Key Biscayne and around Miami through his shady business dealings and connections with Cubans in South Florida. So he has a real personal connection. Barry Goldwater also forms relationships too, because, a central part of his 1964 campaign has to do with criticizing Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And so he kind of reaches out to some Cuban exiles in the Southeast. And so these relationships are forming, but Cuban Americans don't get knitted into the Republican Party in a real central way until later.
Let's start to spin this forward a little bit. I mean, are there other moments in the last few decades that you want to highlight as key moments between the relationship between the Latino community and the Republican Party?
I mean, I think that one key transition is the period between the Nixon administration and the Reagan years, where Nixon's approach to recruiting Latinos was really based on a politics of patronage and economic uplift. So he was about high-level appointments, like the first treasurer of the United States, who was Hispanic, Romana Acosta Bañuelos, a businesswoman from East Los Angeles. And he made other appointments to the Office of Minority Business Enterprise, which he had created, and to lead the Small Business Administration. So it was about appointments. It was about creating more federal jobs for Latinos. And he was all about kind of inclusion and empowerment that way. And the shift between Nixon and Reagan is that Reagan said that he wasn't going to go about reaching out to Latinos through this kind of patronage politics. It was much more based on ideology, and he was going to try to articulate the core values that brought together Hispanic Republicans under the same roof. And it was family values, it was a work ethic, it was patriotism, it was anti-communism. And I think in many ways, the playbook has remained remarkably consistent from the 1980s forward. It's still about articulating these core concepts that are supposed to bring together all Latino Republicans. So, and Reagan was the first to try to articulate that.
And is it the case that the playbook has remained the same because it's a good playbook, or because no one has bothered to actually examine how Latinos actually operate?
I think it is both, because, I think both things happen right now. I think the way that the Trump campaign, for example, tried to appeal to Latinos was by both trying to articulate this broad-based message that had to do with his economic platform and lowering taxes and slashing financial regulations and touting his economy for how well Latinos have done under it, at the same time that he's really tried to reach out to them, all Latino groups, wherever they are, Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, everywhere, by talking about his administration as a real defender of religious liberty. And that's not just the politics of abortion, but it's charter schools with religious identities and a general desire to blur the lines between religion and public life. And then there's, of course, like the socialism and anti-communism stuff, which also, even though we talk about it as though it's really about Cubans and Venezuelans, I think all Latino national groups have their own version of anti-socialism and anti-communism. So, statehood advocates in Puerto Rico have long seen the independence movement activists, the independentistas, as, radical Marxists and communists. So they have their own version of this story. I think these are the, religion, the economy, socialism, these are the kind of broad-based appeals that the Trump administration has used, just like the Reagan administration, to appeal to Latinos over the decades.
So we are recording this a few days after the election. Joe Biden has been declared the winner. But a lot of the specific nuances of the race, especially related to demographics and how different groups voted and so forth, that hasn't really come out. And I tend to want to wait a little bit before really painting a picture of that and knowing what the real story is. So I guess I kind of want to ask you less about the numbers of Latino voters and more about the narrative that has emerged, because there is this narrative that Latinos, particularly in places like South Florida or along the Texas border, swung hard for Trump, and they were targeted in a particular way, and that worked. So in terms of narrative, what are you seeing out there? What is frustrating to you, and what looks like it might actually be onto something?
Thank you for asking. This is the thing that I'm obsessing over right now. But, I think two narratives are emerging at the same time, but the people articulating each of those narratives are only advancing their one narrative without understanding that they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that those two things are these. I think it's objectively true that a sizable percentage of Latinos shifted toward Trump, not just in South Florida, not just in South Texas, but in literally every state. So that's one narrative. The second narrative is that Latinos have showed up in record numbers. I've seen as much as 65% of eligible Latino voters voted this year, which would be a record. I mean, usually it's about 50%. So continuing on this narrative, the record number of Latinos voting have helped Biden win, possibly, I think we're recording when we don't exactly know what's going on in Arizona, Nevada, that Biden's Latino support helped him win in those places, and probably others like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, where the number of Latinos who voted certainly covers the razor-thin margins in these states. So these are two narratives, that the Latino vote moved toward Trump and record Latino turnout helped Biden win in particular places. And I can foresee an emerging argument over those two things, but I really think that they're not mutually exclusive. I think more Latinos, if a greater number of Latinos shows up to vote and a greater percentage of Latinos supports Trump, I think all that means is that there were more Latinos who voted for Biden and more Latinos who voted for Trump. And I think we have to try to explain both of those things at the same time. It's possible that those two narratives are just contending right now, and we haven't kind of assimilated them and integrated them yet, just because we're still kind of in the middle of the fight. But I think that we'll have to integrate and assimilate those narratives and figure out what they mean over time.
I'm curious, Jerry, whether you think, could the Latino vote ever go majority Republican?
I don't know what I think about that question, but I can tell you what Latino Republicans have thought about that question. I mean, they definitely thought that that was a real possibility during the George W. Bush years after he won. George W. Bush, according to Hispanic Republicans, kind of pulled the Republican Party back from the brink of its peak nativism and xenophobia during the 1990s with Prop 187, Pat Buchanan, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, this punitive law signed by Bill Clinton, but really championed by Newt Gingrich's Congress. I believe this is probably the stuff you're thinking a lot about these days, Niki.
Yes, absolutely.
So, George W. Bush was the kind of savior of the Republican Party and brought it back to, this period of inclusion and big tent republicanism. And, he won 40% of the Latino vote for the first time. And after he was elected, that's when Hispanic Republicans said that this was the party of the future, George W. Bush's party of the future. And it's just endlessly fascinating to me that Donald Trump could, in the final analysis, be something like the second coming of George W. Bush as the person who somehow managed to expand Latino support with a message that to many of us seems almost the exact opposite. So I don't know if you've been following Marco Rubio's Twitter account in the past couple of days too, but he is now saying that the Republican Party of the future is going to be the party for Hispanics, African Americans, and working class Americans. You might have some ideas about this, Niki. I can't tell if it's just a kind of rehash of the 2013 Growth and Opportunity Project thing, where we're just going to return to this, era of inclusiveness and we're going to be a big tent party, or if it's that in combination with wrestling with some of the things that the Republican Party will want to pull forward from Trumpism.
So I will very quickly answer this, which is to say that the Growth and Opportunity Project, which had been sort of the Republican autopsy after the 2012 election, did have all of these sections on winning over the Latino vote, but all of their recommendations were things like be nicer and less racist. And it was all rhetorical, is what I'm saying. It wasn't necessarily a lot of policy propositions. So if there's a new autopsy, it will probably look very different.
All right, let's leave it there. So Jerry Cadava, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun, and we'll keep the conversation going into the next months and years.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I also happen to believe that during the decade of the 80s, the United States needs a president of Hispanic origin, bilingual in Spanish and English, fully understanding of both cultures, that anyone born in this country who prepares himself, who works hard, and is willing to shoot for the moon can one day become president of the United States.
Radiotopia.